I was sitting in my office, the rain loudly pouring down onto the glass of the window. I was wet, freezing, and miserable. The mug of freshly made tea in my hands was probably the only object which had a temperature not in the single digits. It was 1978, and the night which was to come was probably the scariest of my life. The clock had barely struck midnight when one of the shift supervisors burst into my office.
Sir, we have a problem.
Mark said, clearly out of breath from running. What's the problem? I responded, taking a sip from my tea.
It's Greg. He's unconscious.
Mark stuttered out, between deep breaths of the cold air. What the hell do you mean by that? I said, placing the hot tea on the table in front of me.
He just collapsed in the mine.
Mark said. There had been talks for decades about miners seeing a strange ghostly figure down in the coal mine, but most of us just took no notice of it. My God, I was such a fool for ignoring it. Well, we'd better take a look, I said, standing up and heading over to the door of my office, picking up my hard hat and lamp on the way. We entered the lift and started the slow decline towards the mine shaft. We stood in total silence. The scary part was that Greg had always joked about the ghosts in the mine, claiming that it was more scared of him. He was what you would call a skeptic about the paranormal, and yet he was claiming to have seen it. The lift halted. Mark slid the door open, and we started to walk down. The oil lamps placed on the ground and being hung from the stone walls were the only thing lighting the path. When we arrived at Greg, who was at the end of the lamps, beyond that, total darkness. A small group of the other miners had already started to gather around. He was curled up on the stone floor, jabbering.
He's there. He's there.
Scared out of his mind. I kneeled on the ground. Greg, what happened? I asked, trying to sound sincere.
I saw it.
Greg said clearly, terrified out of his head. Who? I asked him.
The spirit.
He stuttered out.
What do we do, sir?
Mark asked over my shoulder. Call the doctor, there's nothing we can do for him, I said solemnly. Mark and two of the other miners walked Greg back to my office. I stood in the orange glow of the oil lamps for a bit longer, watching everyone go back to work. Then I heard it. A scrape sound, like metal being dragged along the ground, coming from the darkness ahead. Hello? I shouted into the blackness. I switched on my headlight and wandered into the blackness. The more I walked in the darkness, I continued to hear the scraping. I put my foot down to take another step when I felt Greg's pick under my foot. I bent down and picked it up. I took another few steps forward, then I heard an electronic crackle and my headlamp went out. I was alone in the bleak black darkness, just me and the scraping. Then I heard it.
Stop.
The voice was dry and gravelly and sounded close. I took no notice of it and went to take another step. Then I heard it again.
Stop.
I reached out my hand. I felt nothing in front.
Turn back.
The voice now said. I reached up and smacked my headlight. It briefly flickered on for a few seconds. What I saw in those few brief moments of light still haunt my nightmares to this day. The only way to describe it was a shadow come to life, like a mistake in the fabric of reality. After seeing that, I quickly turned around and ran to get out of the mine, escaping the darkness and re-entering the safety of the oil lamps. When I left the lift shaft, I saw Greg being taken away in an ambulance.
Sir, they're taking Greg to the hospital.
Mark said. Very well then, I responded.
Are you okay, sir?
Mark asked me. Yes, perfectly fine, I responded, trying to sound calm. We never saw Greg again. Apparently, according to the hospital, he was unfit to continue work. He was taken to a mental institution a few hours away from the small village. As for me, I never stepped foot back in that god-forsaken place after that, and I ended up leaving the job a few years after the incident. If I have to give you one piece of advice, if you ever go into a mine shaft and you're alone in the dark and you hear a scrape, leave. Your life will depend on it.